Good afternoon. Welcome to the webinar on the Sustainable Harvest Level Draft Environmental Impact Statement. My name is Mike Buffo, and I'm an environmental planner with the Department of Natural Resources. Thank you for joining us today. The purpose of this webinar is to provide you with an overview of this Draft Environmental Impact Statement, or DEIS, so that you have the information to help you make comments during our environmental review period, which is going on now through March 9th. I'll let you know how to submit comments later in this presentation. In the room with me are additional staff from the Department of Natural Resources, or DNR, who will be able to help answer questions. If you don't get a question answered or still need more information, feel free to submit a comment and we'll be able to address it when we publish our final environmental impact statement. I will start the webinar with some background information on the Department of Natural Resources and State Trust lands. Then I will provide some highlights of the draft environmental impact statement itself. Please note that you can find the entire DEIS, appendices, and supporting information, including posters that we presented at 4 public meetings held around the state earlier this month on DNR's website. We will also be posting this webinar on our website for later viewing. I'll give you the web address later on. The Department of Natural Resources manages just over 5.5 million acres of land statewide. These lands include trust lands, some of which are forested, as well as aquatic lands and conservation lands. The sustainable harvest calculation will apply to forested state trust lands managed by DNR in Western Washington, about 1.4 million acres in all. I will show you a map of this area later on. There are 2 groups of state trust lands: granted trust lands, listed on the left-hand side of this slide, and state forest trust lands, listed on the right-hand side. The granted trust lands were granted to the state of Washington at the time of statehood for the purpose of providing revenue for schools. The granted trust lands beneficiaries are listed on the left side of the slide. The state forest trust lands were forest lands that at the time of the Depression in the last century were abandoned by their owners, leaving counties to manage these lands without receiving property taxes. These lands became a significant burden for the counties, and it was decided to move these lands into state ownership, but the counties were designated as the beneficiaries of the revenue generated from these lands. Both granted and state forest trust lands have been managed by the Department of Natural Resources since it was formed in 1957. At that point, DNR was given the responsibility to be the trust manager for these lands on behalf of the state of Washington. This pie chart shows the proportion of acres that are in each trust in Western Washington. If you look at this pie chart on DNR's website, it looks slightly different because it includes DNR managed lands across the entire state. This chart looks specifically at the 1.4 million acres of forested state trust lands in Western Washington. You can see that most of these lands are either in the Common School Trust, one of the federally granted trusts, or in the state forest trusts, where counties are the beneficiaries. Management of these trust lands comes with something we call the trust mandate, which is described here. You'll notice that DNR has a legal fiduciary obligation under the state constitution to generate revenue and other benefits for each trust in perpetuity, as well as maintain undivided loyalty to its beneficiaries. You'll also notice that DNR must act impartially with respect to current and future beneficiaries. Decisions about the management of these trust lands are made by the Board of Natural Resources. This board makes all policy decisions for the Department of Natural Resources. As you can see, the board is made up of the elected Commissioner of Public Lands, as well as a number of representatives for beneficiaries, including the University of Washington, Washington State University, the Superintendent of Public Instruction, and a representative for timber counties. Also on the board is a representative for the general public, which is the designee of Government Jay Inslee. This board is the decision-making body that will receive your comments on this draft impact statement and will set the sustainable harvest level. So why is DNR calculating a sustainable harvest level? State law requires DNR to periodically calculate the volume of timber that can be sustainably harvested from state trust lands while meeting all legal and policy objectives. DNR policy states that the sustainable harvest level must be recalculated every 10 years. This is a scheduled recalculation of the sustainable harvest level. A change to the sustainable harvest level affects the management of state trust lands by affecting harvest rates and revenue generated on these lands. It has an effect on the funds provided to trust beneficiaries, which includes schools and county services. The sustainable harvest level is set for forested state trust lands in Western Washington, shown here in blue, separately from Eastern Washington lands, which are not shown. In addition to state trust lands, DNR also manages natural areas, shown in orange. No commercial harvest takes place in natural areas, but these lands are considered when setting the sustainable harvest level because the lands help DNR meet conservation objectives. When managing state trust lands, DNR follows state and federal laws. Key laws DNR follows include the state's Forest Practices Act and the Federal Endangered Species Act. To comply with the Endangered Species Act, DNR has a habitat conservation plan. This plan includes management strategies to protect threatened and endangered species, as well as unlisted species. Management of state trust lands also follows DNR's policy for sustainable forests. The policy for sustainable forests directs that state trust lands be managed for economic, social, and ecological benefits. An example of one aspect of this is the deferral of harvest of old-growth forests. The policy for sustainable forests directs that when calculating the sustainable harvest level, DNR use 20 sustainable harvest units. These units are based on trust beneficiary and location. I will talk more about these units later in the presentation. The Board of Natural Resources sets the sustainable harvest level. The board reviews many factors when setting the sustainable harvest level, including environmental impacts and financial impacts. This presentation is about environmental impacts. The Board of Natural Resources directed DNR to prepare an environmental impact statement for the sustainable harvest level to assess the effects of the level on the environment. Financial effects will be analyzed in a separate document that will be presented to the board in the summer of 2017. For the DEIS, a range of alternatives were created. The next set of slides will describe these alternatives. There are 5 alternatives in all, a no-action alternative and 4 action alternatives. The no-action alternative considers what would happen if no change in the current sustainable harvest level was made. The action alternatives differ in 3 ways. Marbled murrelet conservation, based on the marbled murrelet long-term conservation strategy alternatives, arrearage harvest level, and riparian thinning level. I will describe each of these in the following slides, starting with marbled murrelet. The long-term marbled murrelet conservation strategy is under development. Alternatives for this strategy are analyzed in a DEIS released jointly by DNR and the United States Fish and Wildlife Service. The marbled murrelet long-term conservation strategy DEIS considers 6 alternatives. 5 of these alternatives are incorporated into the sustainable harvest alternatives. Alternative C is not included in the sustainable harvest DEIS because the area of marbled murrelet conservation in alternative C is similar to the area in alternatives D and E. Arrearage harvest. Arrearage may be a new term for you in a forestry context. So what do I mean by arrearage? Arrearage is the difference between the volume that was planned for harvest and the actual volume sold during the last planting decade. In the last planting decade, the sustainable harvest level was set at 5.5 billion board feet. The actual volume sold was less than this. The difference was 462 million board feet, which is a bit less than 1 year's worth of timber harvest on state trust lands in Western Washington. The board was interested in looking deeper into arrearage and created a subcommittee to do so. They found, when comparing planned harvest levels to actual harvest volumes by sustainable harvest unit, actual harvest exceeded planned harvest in some planting units, but not in others. If you add up the volume planned but not harvested in sustainable harvest units with deficits, the result is 702 million board feet, or a bit more than 1 year's worth of harvest from state trust lands in Western Washington. The 462 and 702 million board feet of arrearage values are used in 3 of the 4 arrearage options. They are paired with different time periods in which harvest of this volume could occur. For example, one option proposes the harvest of 702 million board feet of arrearage volume in 5 years. A fourth option is to roll arrearage into the inventory. This option acknowledges that the volume that was planned for harvest but not harvested in the last decade is still standing on the landscape and is included in DNR's forest inventory. A sustainable harvest level could be calculated without specifying a harvest of a specific amount of arrearage volume, and that's what this fourth option considers. Riparian thinning. One source of arrearage was that the planned amount of riparian thinning did not occur in the last decade. As shown on this slide, the planned volume from riparian thinning was greater than the amount actually harvested. Riparian options in the alternatives include thinning projections that approximate these levels of riparian thinning. For the higher level of thinning, the sustainable harvest volume is calculated by allowing thinning on up to 10% of the total riparian area in a decade. The lower level allows for thinning an area equal to 1% of the non-riparian harvest area, about the rate of riparian thinning that actually occurred in the last decade. So in other words, if 100 acres of harvest or thinning takes place in upland areas, 1 acre of thinning could be done in riparian areas. The alternatives in the DEIS were created by combining different marbled murrelet conservation strategy alternatives, arrearage harvest options, and riparian thinning options. Alternative 1, the no action alternative, also differs from the action alternatives because the harvest volume is set to the existing sustainable harvest level as set by the Board of Natural Resources in 2007. We used a computer model to calculate the harvest area and volume under each alternative. The model takes in a lot of data, including detailed geographic information, information about the current forest conditions and forest growth. It also requires economic assumptions about the revenue from timber sales and the costs of management. Law and policy are also incorporated. The model produces information about forest conditions, harvest area, and harvest volume by decade for a multi-decadal period. These results from the model are used in the analysis of the alternatives. The model shows a range of harvest and thinning acres across the alternatives and a corresponding range of harvest volumes. Using the information about harvest levels and forest conditions from the model, our analysts look at the effects on 6 elements of the environment due to the sustainable harvest level. Socioeconomic impacts are not included here. However, as mentioned previously, a financial analysis will be presented to the Board of Natural Resources in the summer of 2017. The public can make comments to the board regarding the financial analysis. So what did our analysts find? They found that existing laws and policies mitigate impacts. Existing laws and policies result in almost half of the land base being unavailable for harvest or thinning, or in areas where only thinning can occur. Under all alternatives, the area of complex forest stands increases over time with relatively little difference between alternatives. These stands are expected to benefit wildlife by increasing habitat diversity. Aquatic resources also benefit from the influence of more complex forests on streams and wetlands. All alternatives also result in more carbon sequestered over time than is currently sequestered in forests managed by DNR, with small differences between the alternatives. So what's next? This is a summary of the environmental review process. Scoping was completed in February of 2015. We are currently in the DEIS public comment period and are accepting comments through March 9th, 2017. We will then produce a final environmental impact statement, which will include a summary of comments and a response to comments. The board will then adopt a sustainable harvest level and DNR will implement this level. While this is happening, the approval process for the marbled murrelet long-term conservation strategy will be occurring. Depending on the results of that process, the board will adjust the level following the adoption of a marbled murrelet long-term conservation strategy. For more information, visit our website. There you will find the complete DEIS and appendices and links to board presentations about the sustainable harvest calculation. The comment period runs until 5 p.m. on March 9th. You can submit comments by mail or email. Please include the SEPA file number shown here with your comment. Whatever comment you decide to make, please be specific, clear, and concise, for these comments are the ones that are most useful to us. Thank you for joining this webinar. We now have some time to answer some questions. I have a question here. The question is, has the DNR shared the formula to proportionally allocate the lower arrears number to the various trusts? In Chapter 2 of the draft EIS, you can read about the alternatives, and the allocation of arrearage volume is described in that chapter, and it's described in the chapter at the sustainable harvest unit level. Okay, I have a question asking, how can you set the sustainable harvest level before the marbled murrelet long-term conservation strategy is decided? It seems backwards. Both projects are actually needed by DNR for different reasons. Currently, we're operating under a sustainable harvest level that was set for last decade and is in fact outdated for this decade. So we need to move forward with that project. In the meantime, of course, we need a long-term conservation strategy for marbled murrelet, which we are working on now. If the level is set for the sustainable harvest level now, we could recalculate if there is a need to following the selection of a marbled murrelet long-term conservation strategy. A question is, when will the marbled murrelet long-term conservation strategy and its decision be made? I don't know exactly that. Ultimately, the decision will be made by the Board of Natural Resources, at which time DNR will apply for a amended what's called incidental take permit with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and they will have the final decision on the granting of that permit. I would anticipate that it would be several years in the future. So I have a question asking to explain riparian arrearage and the two different numbers, I guess the 702 and the 462 million board feet of arrearage volume. Just to be clear, that's not all coming from riparian areas or is not due to the lack of harvest in riparian areas. The 462 million board feet of arrearage considers the Western Washington-wide planned harvest minus the actual harvest in that time period, while the 702 number comes from looking at arrearage on a sustainable harvest unit by sustainable harvest unit level. Riparian thinning is done under the Riparian Forest Restoration Strategy and is authorized under the Habitat Conservation Plan that we use at DNR. And so the two riparian options look at two different levels of riparian harvest. The question came in that is it fair to say that DNR's base sustainable harvest level without arrearage is below 400 million board feet for Western Washington per year? And that level, the around 400 million board feet per year level, includes the marbled murrelet conservation alternative F. It includes arrearage rolled into the inventory and a lower level of of riparian thinning. So it's all three of those together that result in that level of harvest. And the question asking, is it fair to say that's the base level? That's not the base level. That's just the level for that alternative with that combination of murrelet conservation, arrearage harvest, and riparian thinning. The question came in about whether the National Marine Fisheries Service and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service have been involved in creating the marbled murrelet long-term conservation alternatives. The answer is yes for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the National Marine Fisheries Service has been informed about that, but the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has responsibility for upland species, which include the marbled murrelet. In December, DNR jointly released with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service a draft environmental impact statement on marbled murrelet, and that is available on DNR's website. You can check it out at www.dnr.wa.gov/mmltcs. I have one last question regarding the arrearage volume and how it is shown in actually Appendix G of the draft EIS. There is also graphs of this in Chapter 2 that show, if you're interested in that, like the numbers I presented today are the total harvest level. If you're interested in seeing arrearage harvest level separate from the sustainable harvest level, you can check out tables in Appendix G of the draft EIS and graphs in Chapter 2 of it. Just want to thank everyone for participating in this webinar and invite you to submit comments by March 9th, and please do so by mail or email. Thank you.